NATO's door is open to Ukraine, but the alliance is unable to accept Ukraine as a new member while in the midst of a war with Russia. We'll bring you live coverage of the press conference following the meeting shortly. But in the meantime, let's speak to our correspondent, Alexandra von Namen, who's in Oslo. Alexandra, what sort of timeline are we looking at for Ukraine joining NATO right now?
Well, that is, of course, one of the most controversial questions being discussed here because, as you just said, all NATO countries in principle agree that Ukraine should join NATO, but eventually, once the war is over, offering Ukraine a membership now would mean that the alliance would be dragged into a war with Russia. But the question is, what can they offer Ukraine instead of a full membership right now? And we have some allies in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, for instance, who are saying we need to offer Ukraine a concrete roadmap to accession because they have proved themselves fighting against Russia, defending, so to speak, also the rest of Europe. And they have been supplied with all kinds of Western-made weapons systems. But there are also other NATO countries who are more cautious. They don't want Russia to retaliate. So this discussion is still going on what to offer Ukraine, and I think there are some signals that they are getting closer to an agreement, but time is also running out, sort of, because at the beginning of July, NATO leaders will come together for the next summit in Vilnius in Lithuania, and they want to have an agreement by then to send a strong signal to Ukraine that the West is supporting them and that they have a concrete plan for Ukraine.
What about the topics that are being spoken about? What about fighter jets, supplying Ukraine with them? That's a big topic right now. Are foreign ministers there looking at that as well?
Well, I can imagine that they have spoken about that topic as well on the sidelines of their meeting here in Oslo. As you know, several NATO countries have offered Ukraine to train Ukrainian pilots on modern American-made fighter jets. But we are still waiting for a decision about delivering such fighter jets to Ukraine. Norway, for instance, the host of this meeting, is part of this effort, and I asked their foreign minister whether they have made a decision to deliver those jets to Ukraine. She told me not yet, but definitely this fighter jet coalition could get much bigger.
Alexandra, thanks for the analysis. We'll come back to you in a moment, and we'll be keeping an eye on that press conference, of course, for you. But first of all, let's pick up on that issue of fighter jets. Ukraine's long been making the case for them, saying they could help it achieve victory in this war. Now, following the green light from US President Joe Biden, transatlantic efforts are also underway to supply US-made F-16s.
It was a powerful symbol of a country desperate for help. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky gifting a fighter pilot's helmet to his British hosts earlier this year.
I will explain. The writing on the helmet reads, "We have freedom, give us wings to protect it."
It was a message he would repeat time and again, whenever and wherever he could.
We also need modern fighter jets.
Ukraine says fighter jets like the US-built F-16 would provide air cover to ground forces, protect people and critical infrastructure from Russian drone or missile attacks, and help them win this war. Now, its allies have answered the call.
The United States, together with our allies and partners, is going to begin training Ukrainian pilots in fourth-generation fighter aircraft, including F-16s.
The international fighter jet coalition looks like this. The US, UK, France and others have pledged to train Ukrainian pilots on modern fighter jets. That paves the way for Kiev to get its hands on the cherished F-16 model. Exactly where from and when is not yet clear.
The very first Ukrainian F-16 will be one of the strongest signals from the world that Russia will only lose because of its own aggression. It will become weaker and further isolated.
For now, Germany has stayed out of the coalition, but Defence Minister Boris Pistorius has not ruled out playing a supporting role in the future.
Fabrice Potier is a former NATO policy chief and the CEO of the international security consultancy firm Rasmussen Global. He recently met with policy leaders in Kyiv. I asked what Ukraine needs most from its Western allies.
I would say two things. The one you were mentioning in your previous report, combat aircraft, fourth generation combat aircraft, in order to compensate the fact that they are running low on air defense ammunitions, which, as you also reported, the Russians are putting more pressure on over the last few days. And on the longer term, I think what they really need is the guarantee that they belong to the Euro-Atlantic security order. And you can do that in two ways. One is providing security guarantees alongside the US-Israel model with real commitments by a group of guarantors, including Germany, and at the same time start a credible path to NATO membership. Because I think this is going to be the best way to make sure Ukraine can defend itself and actually can be part of how we defend ourselves against an aggressive Russia.
Well, those pledges keep coming from both the US and Germany. And the Ukrainian president is currently meeting with European leaders in Moldova, while NATO foreign ministers meet in Norway, all trying to shore up support against Russian aggression. You wrote recently in an op-ed for The Economist that it's time the West committed to Ukraine for the long haul. What do you mean by that?
Well, exactly what I mentioned, which is both NATO membership for Ukraine, and whilst the membership, the integration is obviously not something that is going to happen overnight, to give a bridging solution called security guarantees. And
yeah, but that's not going to happen overnight, is it, as you say?
Well, security guarantees can. It's just, a question of some key guarantor nations like Germany, France, UK, US, Poland, and others to sign real commitments that what they are doing now is a commitment in an open-ended way and will continue as long as it takes. And so it's in a way to put as long as it takes that the G7 that was hosted by Germany declared last year, to put that in concrete commitments.
But in saying as long as it takes, isn't that just prolonging this war? We saw German Chancellor Olaf Scholz very early on in the beginning saying that Ukraine is a turning point, promising a more muscular Germany to the international stage. And yet many have since criticised the Chancellor for talking the talk, not walking the walk.
Well, I think Germany has done more than sometimes it is recognized, maybe because it came to doing more through a lot of political contortions, which I think has muddled the message. But if you look on the paper at what Germany is delivering, Germany is leading the way as far as the European contributions are concerned. So that's one thing. Second, I know it sounds dissonant, but I think if you want to cut short this war, if you want to end this war on terms that are sustainable, that means Ukrainian terms, you have to make a long-term commitment. Because fundamentally, this is what will tell Vladimir Putin that the strategy of waiting for another season, waiting for another US presidential elections, even that strategy is not going to give him success. So we need to close that gap in terms of the long-term ambiguity about where does Ukraine belong.
But just explain to me the subtext here. Is it about helping Ukraine bit by bit to hold off the Russians, or is it a whole lot of Western nations worried that Ukraine could, with this heavy weaponry from the West, suddenly drive out the Russians and go further than that and take back the Crimea?
Well, I think that's a bit of an overstretch, but there is indeed the realization that Ukraine is going to emerge and is fast emerging out of this war and the war effort as one of the prime European defense power, military power. And what you want to do here is in order for Ukraine to be a full contributor to European defense and security, is to put Ukraine inside our framework, rather than outside, which is what we have been doing for too many decades. So I think it's both about Ukraine being indeed the front line to hold and contain an aggressive Russia as long as it remains aggressive, but also to make sure Ukraine is inside our framework and our family and our planning so that it's also a sustainable defense player.
Former NATO Policy Chief Fabrice Pottier, thank you very much for being here on DW News.
Thank you very much.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines. Latvia's parliament has elected Edgars Rinkēvičs as the country's next head of state. The longtime foreign minister will become the first gay president in the Baltic nations when he takes over the largely ceremonial role next month. One of Australia's most decorated soldiers has lost a landmark defamation case against the big newspapers. Ben Robert Smith sued them after 2018 reports alleged he was involved in the murder of 6 unarmed prisoners in Afghanistan. The judge said the papers had proved the allegations were substantially true. Wildfires are continuing to burn out of control in eastern Canada. More than 18,000 people have been forced to leave their homes. No injuries have been reported. Officials warn the fires will keep growing with hot, dry and windy weather conditions making firefighting difficult. The EU and US are expected to draft a voluntary code of conduct on artificial intelligence in the next weeks. Both sides hope other nations will sign on. Critics in the tech industry say content-generating programs like ChatGPT pose as much of a risk as pandemics or war.
Ambassador Catherine Tai.
Coordination and cooperation. Two recurring themes as top US and EU officials discussed the digital transition at a meeting of the Trade and Technology Council in Sweden. Top of the agenda was regulating artificial intelligence technologies.
So within the next weeks, we will advance a draft of an AI code of conduct, of course also taking industry input, taking input from independents, and then of course invite colleagues to sign up for the drafting in order to have very, very soon a final proposal for a code of conduct for industry to commit to voluntarily.
The US and EU are hoping others will join their efforts to rein in AI.
We had a very intensive and I think productive discussion on artificial intelligence today, including generative AI. I think we share a conviction that the TTC has an important role to play in helping establish voluntary codes of conduct that would be open to all like-minded countries.
Earlier this month, G7 leaders also called for a set of standards to keep AI trustworthy, addressing issues such as governance, transparency, and the threat of disinformation. Now Brussels and Washington are hoping their plans will be the first major step towards a larger, comprehensive legal framework.
US lawmakers in the House of Representatives have passed a bill to avert financial chaos in the nation. The bill to raise what's known as the US debt ceiling passed with broad support from both Democrats and Republicans. The Senate now needs to approve the bill in the next few days to prevent the US government from running out of money to pay its bills. DW's Stefan Simons in Washington has more on reactions to the vote's outcome.
What happens in Washington, D.C. normally is that the spin masters coming out and being on media and everywhere and tell their clientele, conservative or progressive, Democratic, Republican, what they want to hear. So the Republicans, and Kevin McCarthy already started to say, hey, we did great. Here we have the vote. We saved the country. We are open to compromise. You see, we can work as a Congress. It's the Republican Congress who gets things done. This is the message for him. Not so much what in detail he negotiated there, because that, in the eyes of many Republicans, specifically the extreme right Republicans in his caucus, wasn't that great. And the Democrats will do the same thing, say, hey, we didn't give too much away. We still have major investments coming into society, into our economy. Yes, we have to cut back a little bit non-defense spending, but okay, there's worse in life. So this will happen. Overall, I think all Americans, and more than just Americans, should be happy that this is a done deal. Why? Because the Senate is really expected to greenlight this deal, vote on the deal tomorrow on Thursday, and have the votes to get this over with.
In the race to find more renewable energy, scientists are turning to volcanoes as a source of clean power. Researchers on the Spanish island of Lanzarote are testing a new thermoelectric generator to turn high temperatures from volcanic areas into electricity. Can it work? Here's a look at the first experiment.
This contraption is designed to supply energy, 24/7, enough to cover an entire family's needs. The aim is to recapture heat rising from the belly of a mountain. A new approach to geothermal energy. Researchers from Pamplona in northern Spain are holding their breath, hoping the experiment will work.
This is a new system. Unlike conventional facilities, it doesn't need steam-powered turbines, so it can be built on a smaller scale.
An infrared thermometer shows the surface of Lanzarote's volcanic landscape measures between 33 and 37 degrees. Temperatures are key.
I'm hoping that where we retrieve the heat, it's really hot deep down inside the Earth, and at the surface, it needs to be cool.
With heat trapped just below the Earth's surface, Lanzarote's extinct volcanoes are a place for fun and games. But can they be more than a tourist attraction? Is it possible to tap into hot volcanic rock to generate electricity? A first measurement shows just how hot it is below the surface. But is it hot enough?
426 degrees Celsius. That's how hot it is at a depth of 2 meters. That's the temperature that's being released here. 426 degrees, yes.
426 degrees, now 428. The team can't believe it.
Here, feel. But be careful.
Geothermic potential.
Do you believe it now?
More than 400 degrees at one end of the system inside the Earth and less than 40 at the surface. A promising result, because a big temperature difference within the system is what's needed to create electrical voltage.
Thanks to the efficient heat exchangers we've designed, we can transfer the heat directly into the modules and convert it into energy.
Hopes are high here at the testing ground in Lanzarote's Timanfaya National Park that in a few days, precise data will show that the new system to generate energy in volcanic regions actually works.
This energy that we draw from the Earth is available 365 days, 24 hours a day. We want to use it to cover the energy needs of the national park's facilities so that we can dispense with fossil fuels.
A high temperature difference between the surface and 2 meters below it, and a plant that generates electricity from it day and night. Volcanoes hold the promise of an exciting way to harness renewable energy.
And let's take you over to Oslo now to listen in to NATO Chief Jens
also an
Stoltenberg.
opportunity to discuss key issues as we prepare for our summit in Vilnius in July. We had good and constructive discussions on our ambitious agenda. We will take decisions to further strengthen our deterrence and defense, agree a new defense investment pledge with 2% of GDP on defense as the minimum, and deepen our partnerships with our partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Our focus today was on how we can bring Ukraine closer to NATO, where it belongs. NATO is already providing unprecedented assistance. I'm confident that Ukrainian forces now have the capabilities they need to liberate more occupied land. But we need to do more. We are working on a multi-year package of support with robust funding. This will ensure Ukraine's deterrence and defense for the longer term, help rebuild its security and defense sector, and transition Ukraine from Soviet-era doctrine, equipment and training to full interoperability with NATO. We also discussed upgrading the existing NATO-Ukraine Commission to a new NATO-Ukraine Council. This would be a significant step to establish a joint consultative forum with Ukraine, sitting at the table as equals, to discuss key issues for our security. We also addressed Ukraine's membership aspirations. All allies agree that NATO's door remains open, that it's only for allies and Ukraine to make decisions on membership. Russia does not have a veto. And all allies agree that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And we all agree that the most important thing now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign and independent state. We don't know when the war ends, but we must ensure that when it does, we have credible arrangements in place to guarantee Ukraine's security in the future and to break Russia's cycle of aggression. We had a good discussion on all these issues, and I'm confident that we will come to consensus by the summit in Vilnius. I'm also working hard to ensure that Sweden's accession to NATO is completed as soon as possible. I spoke to President Erdogan earlier this week, and I intend to travel to Turkey in the near future. And I welcome that Sweden's new anti-terrorism laws have come into force today. That shows that Sweden has delivered on what they committed to do under the trilateral memorandum concluded last year in Madrid, and demonstrates that Sweden's swift accession will contribute to alliance security. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
The first row, yeah.
Dan Michaels with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much for the question. You said you're confident that you will reach consensus by the summit, but how confident are you that you will reach a consensus that won't disappoint Ukrainians? Nobody is fighting and dying for interoperability or going from a council to a commission. And second, if I may, there's been some sort of nascent discussion of a possible, what's being called a peace summit before the NATO summit. Are you aware of any of that? Is there any discussion of that? Thank you.
So first and foremost, the most important thing for NATO and of course for Ukraine is to ensure that they win this war. And we are providing unprecedented level of support. And at the meeting today and at the Vilnius summit next month, I'm absolutely certain that the main focus will be on how to sustain and step up the concrete military support to Ukraine with equipment, with ammunition, with spare parts, with everything they need to be able to liberate more land. I say that because we need to be extremely focused on that, and also knowing that over the last weeks, allies have stepped up, not only delivering heavy armor, modern battle tanks, but also the United Kingdom has delivered long-range cruise missiles, which are making a difference on the battlefield. And also allies have now announced that they will start training of pilots to be able to fly F-16 and other NATO standard aircraft. So, of course, this is the main focus. This is the most urgent task. This is what we have to focus on every day. And of course, Ukrainians, they are calling for more, and we are mobilizing more support because it will be a tragedy for Ukraine, but it will also be dangerous for us if President Putin wins in Ukraine. It will make the world more dangerous. It will send a message that when authoritarian leaders use military force, they get what they want, and that will also make us more vulnerable. So I say that because I understand, of course, that some of these more long-term issues related to reforms, interoperability, transition from Soviet standard to NATO standard is not perhaps the most urgent task, but it matters. It matters for two reasons. It matters partly because it indicates a long-term commitment, sending a message to Moscow that President Putin cannot wait us out. I believe that in Moscow they think that democracies are lazy, that we are ready to not to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. And we are going to prove the opposite by demonstrating that democracies are actually able to stand up for their values and be there when they are needed to defend democracy and freedom, as we do when we support Ukraine. So these more long-term efforts, the multi-year program of implementing the transition from Soviet era to NATO standards, it sends a message of long-term commitment, which is important. Second, the interoperability also matters for the more shorter term, because it is a challenge, it is a logistical challenge, that there are so many systems, so many different types of weapons, so many different doctrines at the same time on the Ukrainian side. So this is now a war of attrition. A war of attrition is a battle of logistics, and to help us win that battle of logistics, everything we can do to make the Ukrainian forces more interoperable, and at the end fully interoperable with NATO forces, it also actually have a more short-term effect on their ability to win on the battlefield. So, for me, there is absolutely no contradiction between being focused on the urgent need for military support and the more long-term commitment. Also because the long-term commitment sends a message to Moscow that President Putin cannot wait us out. The second question I've forgotten. Well, we welcome efforts to find a peaceful solution, but of course we support the Ukrainian initiatives, the plans put forward by President Zelensky, and I will leave it to President Zelensky and to the Ukrainians to decide the formats and the conditions for any peace talks and political dialogue.
Mr. Neuburg from the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. At the beginning of this war, when NATO countries started to deliver weapons to the Ukraine authorities, it was important that the weapons were not long range, and that they were handed on the condition that they were not targeting Russia on Russian territory. Now asked on what's your reaction to possible Ukraine attacks on Russian soil, your answer is the Ukrainians has the right to defend itself. There is a change of tone, and what has changed?
So fundamentally, the message is the same, that we support Ukraine, but the type of support we are delivering has changed as the war has changed. So as the war has evolved, also the type of support has evolved. In the beginning, the focus was mainly on light anti-tank weapons and lighter weapon systems. Then gradually we moved into delivering heavy artillery. Then not only light and man-held air defense systems, but also more heavier and advanced air defense systems like the NASAMS and the Patriots. And then after some more months, we went into delivering also different types of armor, including the mortars and the different types of also armored personnel carriers that have proven to be extremely important, and now also heavy armor and battle tanks. So yes, you are right that the type of support has evolved, but that reflects that the war has evolved, and that we have realized that actually by delivering more advanced weapon systems, the Ukrainians are able to defend themselves against all these different air attacks, but also to actually use the heavy armor, the artillery, the HIMARS to also liberate more land. But fundamentally, the message is the same, that NATO and NATO allies are not party to the conflict. We help Ukraine to defend itself. That's a right enshrined in the UN Charter, and we'll continue to support Ukraine upholding that right.
Reuters. Thank you. Sabine Siebold with Reuters. Secretary General, could you tell us whether ministers have agreed to hand Ukraine in Vilnius any kind of a roadmap for NATO accession? And you were talking about the framework of security guarantees. Could you work out a little bit on that one? Who should issue these security guarantees and when should they take effect? Thank you.
So first of all, this was an informal meeting. We didn't make any decisions, but we discussed, and it's always useful to have all the allies and also Sweden around the same table. Actually, there was no table sitting there in the ring, but have an informal discussion where the ministers are not reading from manuscripts. Actually, we have an open exchange. Helps us to improve the understanding of where we can find consensus, how we can move forward. And again, first of all, they all agree that NATO's door is open, that Ukraine will become a member, and it's for NATO allies and not for Russia to decide when that will happen. And they also then send a very clear message of the need to focus on the urgent task to ensure that we provide the necessary support, military support to Ukraine, so Ukraine prevails. Then I think what we all realize, but we still have work to do, we still have consultations before we can make decisions, is that wars are unpredictable. No one can say how and when this war ends. But what we do know is that when it ends, we need to ensure that we have the frameworks in place to ensure that this is not a pause in a pattern of Russian aggressive actions against Ukraine. Because the war didn't start in February last year, it actually started in 2014 with first Crimea and then later on that they went into Donbass. And we need to stop this vicious circle of aggression against Ukraine because we need to be sure that what happens after is some kind of end, that Russia reconstitute, rest, and then regroup, and then attack again in some months or some years. And to ensure that we actually stop it there, we need to provide long-term military support to Ukraine, multi-year programs, as we have discussed, but also look into what kind of frameworks that we can establish to provide the necessary guarantees that President Putin is not able once again to attack Ukraine. The details, how this will be done, what kind of mechanisms, that remains to be decided. But the idea of preventing history from repeating itself, preventing President Putin from continue to be able to chip away at European security, that's the aim, and then we discuss the means to achieve that.
Swedish Radio.
Mr. Secretary General, according to your trip to Ankara, more concrete, which day will you go? Does the President Erdogan knows that you will come? And will try to go there together with the Swedish Prime Minister and perhaps even with the Prime Minister of Finland? Thank you.
Well, I'm invited by the President, so our staffs are now looking into the practicalities on the exact dates. I spoke with him 2 days ago, President Erdogan. And one of the things we then agreed that I should go once again to Ankara. I went there also this fall to Istanbul, spent some days there to discuss how to make progress, and also different phone calls and meetings has enabled us to make progress. Partly, first of all, actually to have the decision in June last year to invite Finland and Sweden, which was a big decision that we all made together, also President Erdogan last summer. Since then, I have been in close and constant contact with the political leadership in Ankara, my staff. We have this permanent mechanism that meets also regularly, and then we agreed on the way forward, and also to ensure the ratification of Finland, and now there has been a period of elections in Turkey, so then the contacts have not been so close and so intensive. But since now the elections are over, I think it's important to then restart the dialogue and the process. The plan is for me to go alone, but I'm absolutely certain that there will be other formats also to engage with the Swedish political leadership, and of course we also stay in very close contact with Stockholm. I spoke with the Swedish Foreign Minister here at the NATO Ministerial, and of course we'll stay in close contact with Stockholm.
Jon Happ, News Agency.
Thank you. Binna Chung of Vienna News Agency. Secretary General, yesterday you strongly condemned the DPRK satellite launch, but today the DPRK said, rejected those criticism, insisting, if I quote, it's the right to self-defense of them. And do you have any further comments on this? And if I may ask another one, at the Vilnius summit, what can we expect to be discussed in terms of stepping up cooperation with the Indo-Pacific partners? Thank you.
So I strongly condemn the military satellite launched by North Korea using ballistic missile technology. This blatantly violates several UN Security Council resolutions. It's a threat to neighbors and a challenge to global stability. And of course this launch raises tensions and poses serious risks to the security of the region and beyond, and it's a very clear breach of different UN resolutions. NATO calls on North Korea to cease these provocative actions and to return to dialogue in order to achieve sustainable peace and a complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We stand together with our close partners in the region, the Republic of Korea and Japan. And as you may know, I visited Japan and the Republic of Korea not so long time ago, and the message there was that security is not regional, security is global. What happens in Asia matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for Asia. And therefore it is even more important that NATO allies are strengthening our partnership with our Indo-Pacific partners. For the second time in our history, we'll have all the leaders of the 4 Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, attending our summit in Vilnius. And we've also seen that there has been also a request to have a NATO liaison office, and we're looking into the possibility of establishing the liaison office.
Okay, we'll take the final question from Vege.
You've been watching the live press conference from the Norwegian capital, where NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has been addressing the press and addressing the issue of the war in Ukraine with foreign ministers of the alliance. DW Brussels Bureau Chief Alexandra van Namen is also at the summit in Oslo. Alexandra, we just heard NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg saying that all allies are in favour of Ukraine joining NATO in the future, but is NATO really united on this?
Well, I think what we can say is that allies are united that Ukraine should join NATO one day, eventually, once the war is over. But they are still not on the same page on what they could offer Kiev right now. And we know that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been adamant, has been demanding a concrete roadmap to membership, even though the war is still raging and the discussion about that is still ongoing. And I just heard from the Polish foreign minister, for instance, who told us that there are still 2 camps there. Some NATO countries are in favor of giving Ukraine this kind of road map to accession. Others are more cautious. And of course, they're all hoping, and Jens Stoltenberg said that he is very confident that they can agree soon on that issue, because, as you know, leaders will be coming together at the beginning of July for a summit in Vilnius in Lithuania, and they would like to have an agreement by then. They would like to have something to offer to Kiev.
Well, in saying that we need to have, or NATO needs to have a plan in place once this war ends, he seemed to cause some uncertainty in that he went on to say, when will we know that it really is over? Because this war began back in 2014 in the East, not just the full invasion on the 24th of February 2022. And will we really know if it's just a short temporary ceasefire of types? When will we know that this war is over? Can you tell me more about whether or not that causes uncertainty for Kyiv, or whether or not we do have a strong message being sent here by Jens Stoltenberg?
Well, what he said eventually is that they're hoping to be able to send a strong message because, of course, they want Ukraine to keep on fighting. They want to boost their morale. But at the same time, as you just stressed, wars are unpredictable. That is why some NATO countries are so cautious. They want to support Ukraine, but they are cautious. They don't know whether they could offer anything of substance now in terms of a roadmap to accession. That is why there are other proposals on the table. And what struck me here in Oslo was that so many foreign ministers were talking about the possibility of providing Ukraine with security assurances, with security agreements that could help Ukraine get the weapons they need, get the technology they need to defend themselves and to win this war. So that is something that is on the agenda, this proposal to provide Ukraine with security agreements from individual NATO countries. That is something that could also help Ukraine to go into potential talks with Russia to have an upper hand there. And of course, the most pressing issue, as Jens Stoltenberg pointed out, is now to help Ukraine win this war and to prevail as an independent country.
OK, so it's more about these security pledges to give Kyiv the upper hand if it does come down to talks at some stage or negotiations with Moscow, because the promise of a membership in the alliance one day isn't something that's going to stop Moscow, is it? But at the same time, this urgent need of military support, Jens Stoltenberg saying this was a war of attrition, that it is a battle of logistics, that is also another clear signal to Moscow that Ukraine has the support of the Western world.
Well, yes, indeed. And another important topic that the foreign ministers are dealing with is whether they are willing to provide Ukraine, for instance, with Western-made fighter jets. That's on the agenda. They will start training Ukrainian pilots on those fighter jets, and we can assume that once the training is over, they will be willing to provide those fighter jets to Ukraine.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your live coverage, Alexander Phenomen, for us in Oslo at that meeting of foreign ministers from NATO. A reminder of our top stories here on DW News. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed a summit of European leaders in Moldova. They're discussing security concerns in the face of Russia's ongoing aggression. That's as Russian forces launch another aerial assault